data alone, as what I think what you were saying, is dangerous without a story, and a story is dangerous without data. So you need our perspectives on it. They're a couple of my quick takeaways, but
this was designed as a national survey of the general Australian population to obtain baseline population data from the entire Australian population. And one of the significant aspects of that is that this was not designed specifically to be about the experience solely of Indigenous Australians. So we included in our general sample all Australian residents aged 16 and over, people from all cultures, anyone who had a mobile phone who we could reach to conduct a survey with. Our sample, and there were 8,500 people who participated in this survey, did include Indigenous Australians who gave consent. So nobody was excluded from participating, but we didn't design the survey specifically for Indigenous Australians, and our team is not comprised of Indigenous Australians. I'll come back to this point right at the end of the survey because there are some future opportunities and implications of this that I'd love to seek your advice and input about. I will just note here, this is the last dot point on this slide, that we did have 3% of our sample who did identify as Indigenous Australians. And their responses are included in the whole data set and the results that I'm discussing today. However, what's really important to note is that for ethical and methodological reasons, we will not be analysing or publishing data from our Indigenous participants separately. And there's a whole stack of reasons for that. Basically, we are deeply committed to principles of Aboriginal participatory action research and data sovereignty. It would not be appropriate for us to analyse or publish data simply from the Indigenous participants in the ACMS. So all of the results that I discussed today represent the entire sample that we surveyed. I'm going to whip through some of these slides pretty quickly in the interest of time. Again, feel free to contact me at any time if you want more detail, and I'm happy to share these slides with you as well. So some I'll spend a bit more time on the numbers. But basically, to let you know why we did this survey in the first place, we had some big evidence gaps in this country. So until now, we have not had reliable evidence at the population level about the prevalence of each type of child maltreatment. And when I'm talking about child maltreatment, I'm talking about physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and exposure to domestic violence. We also haven't known the characteristics of those experiences. So, for example, how old are children typically when these experiences happen? And who is it who tends to inflict these different types of experience? We also haven't known the associated mental health disorders like, say, depression and anxiety, and health risk behaviours, things like self-harm and cannabis dependence, that are associated with these experiences. So these have been big evidence gaps for us as a country, and this has meant that our national policy approaches to preventing child maltreatment and to supporting families and communities and sectors has been incomplete and uninformed by the required epidemiological evidence. So there's been some big evidence gaps, and that's why we sought funding to do this study. Overall, this entire study is all about advancing public health, social justice, and even the economy, given the massive annual cost of mental disorders and suicide to the nation, which is somewhere in the region of $200 to $220 billion. And we've been doing a lot of engagement with Australian government agencies and state and territory government departments as well, basically to urge them, based on our findings, that they can't afford not to invest more in prevention and support for children and families, given the costs that we've shown and the findings that we've generated. We obviously also have a huge moral and social imperative to support kids and families better. So what we've done in this study is to generate this evidence to fill these gaps. So we've done a huge nationwide survey of 8,500 people to identify the percentage of children who experience these forms of child maltreatment and multiple forms of maltreatment, to identify the characteristics of those experiences, such as how old they are, who it is who inflicts these events, and to identify mental health and health risk behaviours that are associated with maltreatment. And we're also assessing the economic consequences of this in terms of burden of disease and cost of illness. We did a survey of 8,500 people aged 16 and over. I could talk all day about the methodology, and I won't, because we simply don't have time. But what's really important for you to know is that this study was very, very carefully designed over a period of about 5 years. And even after that, we spent the first 2 years of this 5-year project very, very carefully and rigorously designing our survey instrument. And a lot of that work involved taking the best survey instrument in the world that we identified through a systematic review and making that even better. And what we did there was to do a 2-year process of breaking down that survey instrument and making it even better, to thoroughly test and conservatively test the experiences of these different types of child maltreatment. So the first 2 years of the study were all about making our survey instrument as good as it could possibly be. All of this is detailed in our report, which is in plain language for all members of the public and sectors to understand. I won't go further into this at the moment, but I will let you know that we ended up with absolute gold standard definitions of child maltreatment in each of the 5 types. And we built those into the survey instrument so that we were asking about experiences that, on any sound definition based on the international literature, we were really asking people about their experiences in childhood of pretty significant events of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and exposure to domestic violence. So our measurement was very, very rigorous and comprehensive. But wherever there was any doubt, we erred on the side of caution. So we were not asking about trivial or innocuous incidents. We were asking about really serious things. And this study, and you don't like to overstate things at all, but this really is the best Australian study ever done, and it's one of, if not the most rigorous done in the world. And we're very happy that we've reached this point. There's still an awful lot left to do, though. But what I want to clarify here is that the data that we generated are extremely robust. I'm just going to give you one example of how we defined these 5 maltreatment types to show you that we were asking about things that really were quite important experiences or quite severe experiences. So we drew on the best information worldwide about what is child physical abuse. And we defined it as acts of physical force by a parent or caregiver like a parent, and it could include someone within an institutional setting like a teacher that caused injury, harm, pain, or breach of dignity, or had a high likelihood of doing so. We did not include corporal punishment like little smacks to respond to misbehaviour in this definition. And from that definition, and based on our 2-year testing process, we asked 2 survey questions. One was, had the survey participant ever been hit, punched, kicked, or physically hurt by a parent or someone in this parent-like position? The second was, had a person like that ever beaten them up, hit them on the head or face, choked them, or burned them? So as you can see, those are pretty strong experiences. We adopted a very similar process for each of the other types of maltreatment as well. I won't go through all these today, but these were again, very, very rigorously and conservatively drawn. So what we ended up with, we asked 20 different questions, and we gave people the opportunity to tell us if they had experienced those. So we weren't relying on other sources of data. This is self-report data about their experience of these things across childhood, aged up to 18. So each question had a yes or no response. 16 of these questions generated our prevalence data. When someone said yes to any of these questions, we then asked some more questions to obtain information about the characteristics of maltreatment. So we asked them, how old were you when it first happened and last happened? Who were all the people who did these acts, if it was physical, sexual, or emotional abuse? And we also asked if, for physical and sexual abuse, if they'd ever told anyone about it, and if so, how old they were, who they told, and if they felt supported when they told them. We also asked how many times did it happen, if it was physical, sexual abuse, or exposure to domestic violence, or for emotional abuse and neglect, over what period of time did it happen. And I'll just let you know that for emotional abuse and for neglect, we only counted something as emotional abuse or neglect if it happened over a period of at least weeks, so not just days. It had to happen over weeks, months, or years. We then measured the associated mental health and behavioural outcomes of child maltreatment. And you'll see that this study, because of its nature and because of what we were funded to do, it is quite a Western kind of medical approach, okay? And that is both a strength, but it's also a limitation. So we didn't include measurement of various protective factors, for example. We didn't include things like social or family or community connectedness. There's a whole range of things that we haven't asked about in this study simply because we couldn't, but we hope to in future. But we did, for mental health, have a very strong focus on 4 key mental disorders that are recognised, at least in the Western tradition. And this part of the study, given those limitations, is in fact extremely strong because we administered a diagnostic instrument which goes beyond simply asking people about symptoms. So we asked about major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and alcohol use disorder. For health risk behaviours, we asked again about some really serious outcomes. So we asked about smoking, binge drinking, cannabis dependence, self-harm, and suicide attempts. And there were some really chilling, sobering findings about these outcomes of maltreatment. And there are some quite disturbing findings coming up. So I just do encourage you, if any of these outcomes about prevalence or associated mental health or health risk behaviours do cause any concern for you, please do reach out for any support that you may need. So I'm quickly going to turn to the results now, and again, I'll whip through these pretty quickly, but I've tried to draw attention to some of the key ones. We now know for the first time what percentage of Australian kids experience child maltreatment. So we found a 32% prevalence of physical abuse, 28.5% sexual abuse, 30.9% emotional abuse, 8.9% neglect, and 39.6% exposure to interparental domestic violence. Now, some of these findings are very sobering, I think you'd agree. Some were surprising even to those of us on the research team who've been working in this field for about 25 years now. But the value of these data are that they show us the true state of affairs across Australian society. And they give us the tools we need to advocate with government at the Australian government level and state and territory governments to invest more and to invest better in preventing child maltreatment and equally in supporting parents and communities to enable healthy child development and healthy families and communities. And all the way through this study, we've had two major aims. I really hope that you can be encouraged and inspired by this. We've wanted to do first gold standard science for the nation. We had one chance at this, and we had to make sure that the evidence we generated was extremely robust. Otherwise, governments may not rely on, and we've achieved that. The second thing we needed to do was not just to write scientific journal articles. That's important, and we have to do that. But we need to take these findings and put them in the hands of the policymakers and the government leaders who can use the findings to make Australia a better place for kids, parents, families, and communities in Australia for years and generations to come. So we've had quite a massive knowledge translation campaign in an attempt to generate a scientific evidence to research impact pathway. And that commenced late last year with about 30 in-confidence briefings to various government departments, and it has continued this year with launches of our findings and various presentations, including this one today, and the big public event in Melbourne, and lots of individual meetings with government policymakers. That will continue through this year, but it will continue next year, the year after that, the year after that, and so on. We are in this for the long haul. I'll go on now to discuss some more findings. I just want to draw attention to a few key findings for you today and make sure we still have enough time for discussion. A second key finding that we made was that there are some key gendered differences in child maltreatment, and there's two that I'll draw your attention to on this slide. If we look at the bars for sexual abuse, we can see that 37% of our sample, age 16 and over, of females had experienced sexual abuse in childhood. Now, just first of all, we define sexual abuse as sexual abuse by anyone. So this includes sexual abuse by other adolescents in childhood as well, not just adults. But 37% of females in our sample had experienced sexual abuse in childhood, compared with 18% of males in our sample. Now, not at all to downgrade the experience of males who experience sexual abuse in childhood, but clearly we have double the vulnerability for sexual abuse in females, and that is a major disparity that we simply cannot accept. There's a second gender disparity here in the next bars about emotional abuse, right in the middle of the screen. So 35% of females in our sample had experienced emotional abuse in childhood, compared with 25% of males. Now, this is significant not only because it's a numerical disparity, but because, as we'll see in a moment, emotional abuse is extremely damaging for mental health and health risk behaviours. And these are some of the most important findings in the whole study, and something that we want to do more research on in future. I'll come back to that in a moment, but just note that disparity between genders in childhood emotional abuse. This slide shows the prevalence rates of each of the 5 types of maltreatment amongst the youth sample in our overall sample. So our overall sample, we had 8,500 participants. We had 3,500 of those participants who were aged 16 to 24. The value of that strong oversample of youth aged 16 to 24 is that we've got very strong evidence about the rates and the impacts of child maltreatment in relatively recent years in Australian society. Okay, this shows us that some types of maltreatment are actually higher in recent years than they were, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago in Australian society. So in particular, emotional abuse in this younger sample is at 34%, whereas across the whole sample, it was 30%. So that's even higher now. Similarly, you'll see that EDV amongst our younger Australians is 43%, whereas for the whole sample, it was 39%. So for some maltreatment types, not only are they the same, they're actually higher in more recent years. So there's some really sobering, grim statistics here, but I do want to also have some hopeful and positive messages here, and there are some. And two of them are noted first on this slide, and I'll draw some more attention to them in a moment. But first, we can see that physical abuse in the youth sample is 28%, and that is lower than it was for the whole sample. In other words, physical abuse of children in Australian society has declined significantly in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And that's really important. There's probably a number of reasons behind that, but that's a very important decline. If we can keep that decline going, that will be a massive public health achievement, and that's something we absolutely need to do and can do. A second positive note, a second hopeful note, is that sexual abuse has also slightly declined. But here, there's a lot of devil in the detail. I'm going to come to that right now. But some both positive messages here, as well as some cautionary tales. I'll just note very quickly here on this slide, we're showing the prevalence of each maltreatment type again for males and females for each of the 5 types. You can see the gender disparity for sexual abuse is even wider now. And that is the same for emotional abuse. So we've got a major problem, as suggested by this data, about the experience of girls in Australia. Not just for sexual abuse, but also even for emotional abuse. That's something that we can draw attention to and can address in our enhanced policy and prevention efforts. This is important, powerful data. It shows us where we need to make most beneficial changes and indicates where our efforts need to be concentrated the most. Just very quickly, I just want to draw your attention to this slide, which shows that when these experiences happen, they tend not to happen just once. Okay, so sometimes people say, oh, okay, child maltreatment's not a good thing, obviously, but surely it tends to be just a one-off. Well, actually, that's not the case. So if we just use the example of physical abuse, the graphic at the left of this slide shows that for 88% of kids who experienced physical abuse, it happened more than once. For 62%, it happened more than 6 times. And for 19% of them, it happened more than 50 times. So these are really sobering, sad statistics. And I do want to emphasize that while I'm talking a lot about statistics and numbers, behind all of them, there are so many kids who have these terrible experiences in childhood. Now, not all of them, for various reasons, have the same associated health outcomes. That's true, and that's something we need to pay attention to in looking at protective factors that buffer against the worst outcomes. But nevertheless, the key message here is that when child maltreatment happens to kids in our society, it tends to be repeated. Very quickly, this is a slightly complex slide, but the key point that I want to convey here, if we look at the right-hand side of this slide, is that 1 in 4 kids don't just experience 1 or 2 types of maltreatment, but they tend to experience 3, 4, or even all 5 types of maltreatment. So 25% of our youth sample aged 16 to 24 had experienced at least 3 of the 5 types of maltreatment. Okay, so there's a fairly small proportion of kids who experience all 5 types, that's about 3%, but then there's substantial numbers of kids who really have a rough time in childhood experiencing multiple types of maltreatment. Back to some good news and some hopeful stories. And again, it's really important to be mindful of these. This chart shows how the prevalence of physical abuse in childhood has declined over time. Basically, what it shows is that for many, many, many years, looking at our different age groups in our sample, the rate of physical abuse was about 1 in 3 or even higher, 33, 35, 36%. But amongst our younger sample, the 16 to 24-year-olds, it's down to 28%. It has, in broad scale epidemiological data, that is a massive shift in recent years. And it's likely to do with a number of factors. It's likely to do with increased parental education and support, increased awareness of different ways to discipline kids, increased broader social norms about kids' rights to be free from certain types of violence. So this is a hugely encouraging finding, and it's something that we need to redouble our efforts in relation to. Another really positive change is seen in this line graph. And this is about one aspect of sexual abuse. And one thing we did in our analysis is to look at sexual abuse by different types of offender. Now, just to let you know that the largest group of offenders in relation to child sexual abuse is indeed other adolescents aged under 18 who the child victim knew. And that's important because it helps us know that we need to direct a lot of our prevention efforts there. Okay, it also helps us dispel myths about, say, stranger danger, that type of thing. But what this graph shows is that sexual abuse within the home by parents or people like caregivers like parents, like grandparents, for example, has declined also in recent years, and significantly. And when you think about the sheer number of kids who are not experiencing sexual abuse by these types of people anymore, compared with the number that did experience it in former times, this is a huge public policy success. So we can see that in former decades, the prevalence of sexual abuse by parents or parent-like caregivers, like step-parents or, say, boyfriends of a mum, was up at around 8-9%. It's now down to 4.4%. Now, that 4.4% figure is still way too high. Okay, that's one kid in a year 12 classroom of 25 kids. Every year 12 classroom of 25 kids experiencing sexual abuse by a parent or parent-like caregiver in the home. That's way too many. However, that trend line is hugely encouraging. So we need to continue our efforts to keep that trend line going down, but be mindful that sexual abuse by other types of offender have actually increased in recent years. Okay, very quickly, folks, just letting you know some key findings about the mental health outcomes and health risk behaviours. We did indeed find that mental health disorders are far more common in those who experience any child maltreatment. So 48% of all our participants who experienced any child maltreatment met the criteria for a mental disorder, one of the 4 disorders we measured, compared with only 21% of those who did not experience maltreatment having one of those disorders. So a 2.5 times likelihood of having one of the 4 really debilitating mental disorders if you'd experienced child maltreatment. That's a really big difference. We found this difference across all 4 of the mental disorders we measured. The key take-home message is that experiencing child maltreatment dramatically increases the likelihood of each disorder. Conversely, not experiencing child maltreatment dramatically reduces those disorders. So the impact of child maltreatment was clear. And when we did these analyses, we took into account a whole range of confounding variables as well. This is a complex slide, but in simple terms, what I'm wanting to convey here is that when these mental health disorders happen, they happen quickly. So they don't just lay dormant until, say, someone's in their 30s or 40s. They're happening to kids in their teenage years or by the early 20s. And this is important because there can be a cascade of effects. So as well as dealing with the fact that they've experienced maltreatment, they have the mental health disorder crystallize in adolescence, that also affects things like their schooling, their employment, their education, their navigation of relationships, etc. So there's really, really powerful additional reasons to increase our prevention efforts based on these findings. This is a really important slide, and this comes back to the importance of emotional abuse again. And this is one of the reasons why the findings on emotional abuse are some of the most important from the whole study. This slide summarizes months and months and months and months of really complex work. What we did was we took into account a whole range of factors and figured out which experiences of which type of maltreatment have the worst effects on mental health. And essentially, consistently, we found that sexual abuse and emotional abuse consistently have the strongest associations with these mental health disorders. Now, the sexual abuse finding there is not a surprise. There is some international evidence about this, but the emotional abuse finding is really, really important. And this is a very strong finding because we measured emotional abuse in a very rigorous and comprehensive way compared with other studies overseas. So this is a novel finding, but it's very important for policy and prevention in future. So we've shown essentially that if we can reduce the prevalence of emotional abuse, we will have a massive beneficial impact on reducing the mental health burden of maltreatment. We saw very similar patterns for health risk behaviours. So very, very quickly, we found that experiencing any maltreatment is strongly associated with cannabis dependence, self-harm and suicide attempt in the prior year. You've got 4, 4.5 and 6 times in the case of cannabis dependence, the odds of those types of experience. Looking at the flip side of this, if we look at this middle column here, if you did not experience maltreatment, there is virtually zero prevalence of cannabis dependence, self-harm in the prior year, and suicide attempt in the prior year. So these are serious health risk behaviours at the population level. We now know that child maltreatment is a major contributing factor to those outcomes. Okay, and that involved really sophisticated modelling, again, taking into account age group, socioeconomic status, financial hardship, all kinds of factors. Those health risk behaviours, again, when they accrued, they crystallised in adolescence again, which gives us that impetus for reform and fast. And again, this slide again shows the influence of 2 types of maltreatment in particular on these health risk behaviours. Again, it was sexual abuse and emotional abuse that had by far the strongest impact, taking into account a whole range of other factors. 6 key findings then that we can focus on. Unfortunately, we have found child maltreatment is endemic in Australia. We found that multi-type maltreatment is common. We found that Australian youth are suffering now. This is not just a historical artifact. We found that girls are at much higher risk, especially of sexual abuse and emotional abuse. The health impacts accrue quickly, and sexual abuse and emotional abuse have the strongest impact. Incidentally, that's not to downgrade the other maltreatment types and to suggest we should do nothing about those. We should. But it might well mean that we pay more attention to the prevention of, say, emotional abuse and sexual abuse. And we can understand that at least in the way that we measured neglect in this study, neglect is not strongly associated with these particular health impacts. Okay, so there are some really salient findings there. We dedicated quite a few pages in our public report to recommendations about what Australia should do. And this is the start of a long conversation with policymakers and people such as yourselves. And I would love to continue this conversation with you. Just very briefly, we feel we need a national coordinated approach that combines the economic resources and deep pockets of the Australian government with state and territory government workforce capacity and with community sectors as well. We need to invest so much more, but also so much better. We need targeted public health approaches emphasising prevention, informed by the best evidence we now have. We do need some societal level reforms. We need broad policy addressing social determinants of health, things like housing, income support, access to childcare. We need new social norms against gendered violence, and we need new social norms against emotional violence. At the community level, we need more sectoral support to respond to maltreatment through health, education, and services. At the individual level, we need much more support for parents, both prenatally, postnatally, through universal prevention programs, but also targeted to parents who may need most support. For example, if there's any mental health challenges or alcohol abuse or substance abuse. We need sixth, an emotional revolution. One of the key findings of this study is not just about the prevalence of emotional abuse, the gender disparity in emotional abuse, but the severity of emotional abuse for health outcomes. That, if anything, is the single most important finding of the study. We need a paradigm shift in how we treat our kids and how we support parents to treat kids well. And sexual abuse, which is a particular area of expertise of mine, requires ongoing evolution in how we deal with each other, especially in educating kids to deal with sexual relationships, but with relationships in general. So we need turbocharged prevention and education, especially in the childhood years for that moving forward. Folks, I have one more slide I just want to draw your attention to today. Thank you, Catherine. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things that are happening now. So first, we've generated benchmark data, again, at the general population level, and it's informing policy debate now. Ideally, we want to do further studies again with a general sample of young Australians in future to chart trends in maltreatment over time. So to see if those trend lines are continuing going down and to figure out where we need to do more. Our team has been asked by the Australian government to consider the feasibility of a specially designed study of childhood experiences in health and wellbeing for First Nations peoples. Now, I want to say I'm not Indigenous and I'm not an expert in Indigenous research. Nevertheless, my team has been asked to consider this and we are doing our best to do so. I do want to let you know that we are strongly aware that such a study may not be desirable or desired in any form whatsoever. Similarly, some kind of study may be desired, but in a very different form to this benchmark child maltreatment study. Any study, for me, would need to be driven by principles of Aboriginal participatory action research. So it must be designed and conducted by and for First Nations, Australians and stakeholders. To me, it should have a focus on strengths-based approaches and protective factors, and very likely be focused on child and family wellbeing, cultural strength, connection and community. Folks, I would really love your advice about this through any comments anytime. Happy to meet individually or on a group basis with you. We will be holding a consultation workshop later in 2023 about this to get advice as well from key stakeholders. We'd love your contribution to that. We've got a strong Indigenous governance framework for that work involving people like Kath. And we're just taking great care to make sure we do as thorough a job of that as possible. But with that, thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ben. Look, I think my first, as I'm listening to it, a couple of my key takeaways were, it is nice to see at some level the generalised data, because when we hear about child sexual abuse, when we hear about neglect, when we hear about emotional abuse, so often it's only our children that you hear about these things from, even though we say, what about looking elsewhere? If you're really serious about this, look at the problem right across the board. And again, for someone like me who comes from Alice Springs, where that comes up whenever people have something to say. And when I think about, we're always going to look for targeted responses and targeted data, because again, as I was listening to you, I was thinking to myself, well, how much does transgenerational trauma impact on that, self-harm and suicidal ideation and those sorts of things where that parent was harmed? But I was also thinking about, well, what sits for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in emotional abuse when we know we face so much structural racism, when we face so much racism in the media? And again, if you look at Alice Springs, political racism, right? So that is the power to compel every single media agency in the country to call us pedophiles again, to call us, I can't even go into it. So I'm wondering if I look at a study like that and I think there is a way to get better data. Personally, again, I would also say you're right. The fact that the Australian government has gone straight to you defies its agreement on the Closing the Gap principles, which say go Indigenous first, but there's always a way of partnering. And certainly front and centre of my mind is the proposed Centre for Excellence, which would be who you'd partner with on that, because it has to be Indigenous led, it has to be Indigenous owned, it has to be Indigenous informed, because I think what you were articulating there around the complexity of what we're looking at and how you had to be cognizant of all those different things. Well, data alone, as what I think what you were saying, is dangerous without a story, and a story is dangerous without data. So you need our perspectives on it. There are a couple of my quick takeaways, but I think, Pauline, you were going to do some moderation.
Thanks, Catherine. We've got no questions in the chat. But if anybody has a question now's the time to jump in. And if not, we've given Catherine a couple of questions.
Yeah. You have. So look, I think the first one is, how can something like this be applied to multi-sectorial responses? How do we use that? Because we all talk about breaking down the silos. Well, how do you actually do that? You get an awesome study like this, which has looked at all those intersecting dependencies. Now what?
Yeah, absolutely. Can I go back a step and just say I totally agree with both the comments that you made previously, Catherine. And also, if I didn't make clear a few moments ago, I do want to make clear that request to me and my team from the Australian government is not to actually do the study. It's to just do like an initial scoping study about feasibility. But even that, we are having led by two chief investigators who themselves are Indigenous. We have a strong Indigenous governance framework. If any subsequent study was to be done, it would certainly not be done by me and my team. Mm-hmm. We'd be certainly happy to support it, but it would not be done by me and my team. Absolutely not. In relation to multi-sectorial responses, look, that's the $1 million question. And I think the first thing I'd like to say is that these are really complex issues, and that's not a get out of jail free card. We need to think about this very, very carefully. So, and I think I do like a public health model. It does have some strengths to it. And obviously a public health model has multiple layers to it. We have a universal prevention aspect, we have a secondary prevention aspect, and a tertiary prevention. And if we're talking about multi-sectorial responses, one thing to consider is how we have that multi-sectorial response applied at the universal, primary prevention level, and then at secondary prevention, and then at tertiary prevention. I think we also need to distinguish, when we consider multi-sectorial responses, we do need to be mindful that while we're talking about child maltreatment as a concept, different types of maltreatment do have some qualitative differences. Neglect, for example, is so different from sexual abuse that they're just chalk and cheese. So approaches, whether at the primary, secondary, or tertiary level to sexual abuse prevention, are totally different to neglect. Neglect is a feature of the general environment. It's largely driven by structural and economic factors. It's nothing to do with individual wrongdoing. And partly as a result of that, that partly explains why there were not major adverse health outcomes from simple environmental neglect, for example. You can imagine that a kid who might experience environmental neglect is loved and supported by parents, family, community, etc. So that kid may well not require, and that family may not require much or very different things to, say, a child who's experiencing really terrible sexual abuse. So we need to be very, very mindful of the different nature of different types of maltreatment and what they require. I think one thing that practitioners and sectors can be mindful of is being informed by this data about the different prevalence and vulnerability to different types of maltreatment, but also looking at what types of maltreatment do tend to have the worst outcomes and where attention may need to be given to kids and families when dealing with a child or a youth who presents with certain types of maltreatment experiences or health needs. They may need to be alert to the fact that a child is likely not to only be experiencing one type of maltreatment, so they may be experiencing multiple types of maltreatment, which may make them vulnerable to various types of outcomes as well. Similarly, I think when supporting parents, especially in the early years, there needs to be a lot of attention given to supporting parents about certain things to avoid, certain things to promote, but to wrap around parents with the types of structures and supports that they need. One of the things that we have looked to the international evidence to is that some of the best programs, things like home visiting support, things like prenatal and postnatal support, do seem to have the best evidence for the reduction of, say, physical abuse, for example. Other types of prevention, there's less of a really strong evidence base around, but we know that certain social supports in particular can be very helpful. So I think this really requires in some a very, very careful and nuanced and ongoing conversation with people informed by all of this evidence.
Thanks, Ben. We've just got a comment in the chat, Catherine, from John, making reference back to incorporating the connection to culture and cultural safety if there's an additional study done, which I think you've both acknowledged. There is a question from Claire, and it's a question to Ben about should the national administrative data sets need to be disaggregated for emotional abuse, and what's EDV again? It's domestic violence. It's
exposure.
Exposure going forward, so that they'll be more useful for policy and reform.
I think that's a great point. It's very important for any nation and any community dealing with major problems and public health challenges to have its data architecture very, very robust and sound. At the state and territory level, I know that this is not necessarily to be critical, but there are different methods for recording and counting, say, emotional abuse and exposure to domestic violence. We have to have very, very sound methods of understanding and approaching and responding to different types of maltreatment. And that is why we spent the first 2 years of this project very, very carefully mining the international literature about the conceptual models of each of the 5 maltreatment types, looking at how the best surveys around the world had measured them, looking at where those surveys were weak or limited and needed to be improved. And that's why we developed our survey instrument so robustly, so that we've measured these very, very soundly. So I couldn't agree more with you.
Thank you, Ben. I note that we are technically out of time. I just wanted to add one more thought, because I know you mentioned the need, particularly in all families, but certainly something that any of us from the Indigenous sector will say, and that is the need to prioritise strength-based and protective factors. And that tension point that as Aboriginal people we face when we start talking about public health domains, which naturally pushes things and responses into health, when in actual fact, from the Aboriginal perspective, it is all about the care and nurture of families first. That's where our strength and protective factors come from, not from health responses. That's just a general statement, so that to be putting in the minds of thinking. I'd like to thank you. That was fascinating. I'm really grateful, and certainly will be following up, as I'm sure many other people will. Why don't we give Ben a round of applause, because we can. It always feels weird, doesn't it, Ben, online getting a round of applause? But look, thank you very, very much. A quick reminder to everyone that this isn't the end of it. This was just a special briefing for us, and that the study will be shared more broadly I'm just going to scroll back here, on the 23rd of June here in Victoria. So if you've got the time, please put your head into that meeting as well, and we'll get a broader sense of how other people are reacting to the study as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Ben. That was just awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Thanks, everyone.
See you everyone. Bye.